Boardroom Bound, Episode 9. Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder that you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we'll be speaking with Doug MacGray. After graduating from Gordon College, he served a 2-year missionary stint in Micronesia before obtaining a law degree from Suffolk Law School. Doug practiced law in Delaware for 12 years, during which time he counseled nonprofits and served on a number of boards, including the YMCA, a local Ministry of Prison Fellowship, and a homeless shelter. Subsequently, Doug moved into the investment and financial advisory business, where he's continued his board service. He now serves on the board of Missio Seminary and some smaller boards. He also worked with a variety of boards as he manages endowments at Christian colleges and seminaries and other organizations. And in today's show, Doug is going to bring his background and experience working for 7 different boards over time, and also being someone who counsels and advises and reports into boards. Gives him different experiences and backgrounds that he'll be sharing with us. For example, one of my favorite topics we're going to talk about today is all about the mission. It's not about networking. For Doug, finding organizations that you love, that you want to be involved with, where your passion comes out, means your best self comes out. The networking will happen over time, making sure you find that. It's those sorts of nuggets that we'll get when we learn today talking to Doug. So let's jump into the show. Well, Doug MacGray, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast. Delighted to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, I'm excited about this. I've known you for about a year now, and we've had a discussion, and you're one of those people I thought would just have so much value to add in different ways, perhaps, than some of our audience would anticipate, because you have a huge career as a nonprofit board person, but through your role, you're working with families, with endowments, with individuals, with businesses, and many of them have boards where either you're reporting in or you might be giving them counsel about finding people, so you'll be able to give a great perspective about what it's like for you working with them, about characteristics you've seen them very successful. So I think that will translate over really well for our audience today.
Well, that's great. I'm happy to offer any insights I can give you based upon what I've seen for quite a while.
Well, maybe it would be really helpful context scene setting if you could walk us through perhaps how you got onto your first board role, and then, clearly it's proliferated beyond that, and perhaps how you think about how you spend your time. Time is valuable. How do you find the right opportunities where you're adding the most value and choose to give back to boards?
Sure. When I first started getting involved in boards, I remember I just got out of law school and was hired by my first law firm down here in Delaware. And they brought in a consultant that very first year that I was practicing there. I had about 30 attorneys, and the consultant was talking about marketing and sales and all that. And as a new attorney, I just wanted to do the work. I didn't want to go out and get clients. But one of the things that came up was joining boards, and I'll never forget the initial advice was never join a board to get clients. Only join a board if you're passionate about its mission. And
really? I'm shocked. I would have thought it would have been almost the opposite of definitely join for networking.
Yeah, well, he said the networking is great, but if you join a board to get clients, your motivation won't be the same. If your motivation is for the mission, then the other board members and the other people you're networking with there are going to see you at your best.
Got it.
But if you're sloughing it off because, oh gosh, it's another board meeting, then they're not going to see you at your best, and it won't work well. So I thought that was great advice, and I have often joined boards for that double, that knowing that I'll be networking with a group of people I want to network with, but always very, very careful not to use it as a sales platform or anything like that. So,
and just to jump in to clarify then, Doug, so it sounds like, I think this is brilliant advice. You're talking about finding where your skill set and interests align with a board that you're passionate about, knowing the networking will happen automatically. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And it's worked. It absolutely has worked like that. It works slowly like that, of course. But in the meantime, you're doing great work that you love to do. And so when I first started practicing law, I was asked to join a board. I can't remember if I asked or if I looked into it, but it was with a prison fellowship local ministry that was trying to create victim offender reconciliation programs state by state. And so that was the first board I got involved with, and it was a short-term success story because the entity ended soon after about a year and a half because we succeeded. But since then, there's been I think because of having JD after my name and being involved in certain networks, I get asked. And then about 20 years ago, I shifted gears and moved into the investment and financial industry. And so having both of those skills on my resume, as you know, people sit around a board saying, hey, we need a lawyer, or hey, we need financial people. And so I've not had a shortage of opportunities.
It's interesting because on some of the prior episodes where we've talked about it, and I'll link to some of the show notes in here. So Jesse St. Cyr, for example, on a recent episode was talking about become known for a skill set, be an expert in a topic, and people will seek you out. And it's probably what was happening. You're like, I can't remember if I found them or they found me. They were probably finding you because you are that special skill set. So you went from being the lawyer, now you're the lawyer with the finance knowledge and doing those things together. Can you talk about how that brand has been intentional, whether you've been pursuing or being pursued? How does that work?
It certainly started off as not needing to do anything in my mind because, oh, heck, I'm a lawyer and people want them. But then after a time, after quite a while, I had a different, when you say brand, I'm sure I wasn't thinking of it with that word at the time, but I was seeking after to be known for someone who was passionate about particular missions. So there were certain things I really wanted to be involved with. And so wanting to have a reputation that, boy, if this guy's on your board, he's going to go to bat for you. And also kind of the niche where I basically wanted to develop expertise and a reputation for being involved in that area was someone who, with a legal background, the finance background, had a lot of knowledge about planned giving and that kind of niche of development. So trying to find big donors, trying to help those donors to figure out how to make gifts that were tax appropriate and all that good stuff. That's something that a lot of these nonprofits in particular, who, as you know, run very lean staff-wise, often don't have that expertise on staff. So that's been a particular area where I've found that I've become known for.
And when we talk about the nonprofit space, I think this is where we see perhaps the maturity of a nonprofit come into play. Ones that are newer, haven't perhaps figured it out. They might have a board packed with all lawyers, for example, versus an organization that's been around a while and realizes we need a lawyer, we need a finance guy, we need an architect, whatever it might be. So it sounds like that's what you're talking about. The organizations knowing they needed you, those have been the ones that may have come and found you.
Yes, that's true. And the way they come find me, oftentimes, I mean, there was one board I got on because someone just found me on LinkedIn and I checked all the right boxes. And so the next thing I know, I was having lunch with the executive director and one thing led to another.
Now, Doug, this is wonderfully helpful to think about. So I think LinkedIn is an amazing tool, and we can talk about search engine optimization, the right terminology to use. But as people think about their career in general, whatever you're looking for, whether it's to become a CFO or be on a board, that is a great example of how you can work on your branding and your messaging. I don't know if you're intentionally trying to advertise on LinkedIn today for yourself for another board role, but if you were, let's say you wanted your first paid board role, maybe with a for-profit corporation, how would you describe that on LinkedIn? What would you do language-wise to make that known and perhaps bring that home more?
Well, as far as first of all, you want to be known for a particular brand of expertise. So that's one of the most important things. I guess the other thing that they want to see is you are open to being on board. So showing your board membership past and or present. And so if they see those two things, I think that's going to resonate with people that are kind of looking, because you know how it is. I mean, people will sit around a board or an executive director or the president or someone will be talking with a couple of colleagues saying, boy, we need to fill a board role. Someone is going off the board and we need someone to fill this. Do you know anyone? And that do you know anyone turns into, well, I'll search my network if you search your network, that kind of thing. So I do think that making sure that your particular skills are there and making sure that there's certainly something that's shouting out, I'm open to being on a board. I've even seen some LinkedIn profiles that actually come right out and say that. I'm not sure how that works, but I haven't done that. But I think having those things on there have been very, very helpful.
I agree with you in some ways. If you've had board experience, making that very clear, you can make that very prominently clear if you want.
Yes.
I think that sends a clear advertisement, but also shows not only that you want it, but there's a skill set that you bring to it. It's sort of like the old adage about if you're chasing after someone, whether you're interested in being pursued or not makes a big difference. So
right.
if you've gone through, I'm trying to remember the total. Is it 7 boards you've been on at this point?
I think that's right. I was trying to think on my car ride here, and I believe it is 7.
Okay. So tons of different experience, different size organizations, different focus about it. If you were to boil all of that down and say, this has been so helpful, I now know this about board stuff that I didn't before. It helps me prepare me for my next opportunity. What have you learned along the way about that?
Well, other than walking in having passion for the mission. So I guess, I'll start with that. The first thing you want to do with any board membership, I believe, is know a lot about the organization, because one way or another, you want to be motivated to help. And because there are going to be certain days that you do not want to go to the board meeting. And so there's got to be this underlying desire to want to see the institution get from A to B and to help make it sustainable and more effective and all of that. The other thing that's quite important is for people that want to be on boards to understand really what a board member is, because I've found that on a lot of boards I'm either on or reporting to, the level of experience people have with knowing where their lane is varies quite a bit. There are people on boards who really want to run the organization, and there are those who want to show up and check the box that they showed up at a meeting and not do much more of anything else. And so there are a lot of dysfunctional boards that have too many of one or both of those profiles. So the real important thing is what is the role of a board member, and essentially being one of a group of people who make joint decisions. You're not running anything, and being willing to contribute and try to add value as one of many voices. I've found to be critical, and be willing to roll up your sleeves and do the work when you're asked to do it. So it is a multifaceted role, but it is one that has a very specific, limited definition, and you shouldn't go outside of it.
It's really interesting you described that. Our previous episode with Charles King, who is a headhunter, is focused only on filling board seats, all for paid corporations. He stresses much of this point about you need to understand what you're getting into. For example, he talks about 20 years ago, it would be 50 hours a year to be a board director. Now it would be 250 hours, especially at the largest companies. But in the same way, it's understanding what you're walking into. You're not coming there to put your feet up on the table and just say you're a board member. Maybe there are organizations like that, but none of the ones that I want to join would be like that. And it sounds like the same thing. You've run into people like that who are just saying, I'm just trying to check that box.
Well, yes, that's right. I've actually seen it happen. And those people tend not to stay on boards for very long because they don't quite understand what they were really getting into. And sometimes they check some of the right boxes, and that's why they've been asked to be on the board. But there really wasn't a proper vetting process, or they just didn't ask the right questions. I mean, you really do need to ask, because as you just illustrated, it varies. You need to ask, what is the time commitment? And know what you're signing up for. And in addition to board meetings, are you going to expect me to be on a committee or two? What are the other expectations? For one, I'm on an institution of higher learning as one of my boards, and a seminary actually. And they would prefer it if I show up for graduation and a couple of other events. So you just want to make sure you understand the full-time commitment and be sober about it. One of the boards I joined, at one point I agreed to join, but only after I got off of a couple of other boards because it was going to be too much. So the time commitment, being willing to put that time in and knowing what it is, because it does vary from board to board. Some meet quarterly, some meet monthly. So you have to understand all of that before you walk in.
And I can echo that from my own personal experience. So I'm on the local YMCA board here. And in addition to the large main board, everyone is on at least one subcommittee, and those meet at a certain frequency as well. There are volunteer days throughout the year where you're expected to be there, at least the majority of them, because you're representing the board and the community, and knowing that when you're walking into it. And I also found that it was important for me to meet with multiple senior leaders within the overall organization to make sure it was a cultural fit for me. Have you taken that approach as you've gone through your various board roles?
Yeah, yes, Alexander. I made sure in every board that I've joined, I believe I have met with the president or executive director each and every time before joining the board, and just getting to know that individual, asking questions, making sure they were on board with me being on the board, and thought that I was a good fit, and get their take on how the board is doing right now, what's working, what isn't working. That has been very critical. There's one board I got on at one point where the executive director had recently come in, and so most of the board was there before he got there. And it was not a particularly functional thing. And because there was a gap where they didn't have an executive director, a couple of the board members really were running the show, and they were not able to. They were having a hard time letting go and being board members again. And so it was really good to know that before walking in, because I could kind of support him, because I agreed that they were kind of overstepping their bounds. But in every case, getting to know the executive director and some of the other staff folks, if you can get to know them before walking into that first board meeting, has been very helpful.
I like to feel sort of comfortable in any environment I'm going in. And part of that is knowing the people and understanding of what it's going to be and the expectations. But I imagine you may have had similar experience to me from my very first board role to whatever the umpteenth one I'm on now. I remember the first one, walking in the first time, knowing I didn't know much, so probably sitting there fairly quietly in the beginning. Now when I joined, say, the YMCA, my latest board, the new board, I would still probably be a bit quiet the first day just to assess dynamics, but I'll know when I'm going to be chipping in for my core expertise, even if it's the first day. Has that been a similar learning curve for yourself?
Absolutely. The first, probably not the very first board, because we were all brand new, but on every other board that I've been involved with, I really have tried to take the tack of being more of a listener in that first meeting. Some of it is just to really, so I could actively listen and not only hear what was going on, but kind of get a sense of who are the players, intuiting how they think about things, how they approach things, finding out who the alphas are, and just really getting to know what's going on before I really get too actively involved. And generally in the first meeting, it does vary. I think you're right. After a while, the last board that I joined, I think I was a little more vocal in the first meeting than I had been in the past. But the first meeting really is one where you really want to start listening, and then you kind of take your own course as far as how you get your own voice and start using it a little bit more. But there is a fair amount of research that goes into finding out what's going on with the entity. And if you know a lot when you walk into that first meeting, I don't think you should hesitate, but because they obviously have confidence in you when they brought you in. But
right.
You do a lot more listening the first couple meetings than you're going to do later.
And that might be also a hardship for some people adjusting to a board lifestyle. You are one of many voices, and everyone there is, in theory, there for their expertise and add strategic insights. And you're not going to be dominating any of the airtime yourself. It needs to be shared. Right.
And that can sometimes be difficult, and you have to be patient with that. Every board is going to have someone that's going to rub you a little bit the wrong way. But if you're really kind of walking with some sense of humility, that there was a board I was on not too long ago where one of the members, that when I first met the person, really did rub me the wrong way. I thought that this person was not the most constructive board member, but then a particular issue came up, and this person's expertise was needed, and she stepped up, and in an incredible way, I just really grew to respect her. So my initial impression ultimately wasn't correct, but so I do think it makes sense to kind of walk in with some sense of humility, that these people are all volunteers as well. and they've all been asked to be on the board because of their particular expertise. So, you know, approach it with that kind of humility that they're all there and have a role to play as well, despite the fact that they might rub you the wrong way or have some differences.
Well, I would also love your perspectiveness on someone who's been on lots of different boards. When I think of some of the main differences between, say, a nonprofit and a for-profit board recruitment, so like Charles King, the headhunter we talked to, you have someone looking very closely, not only at the right skill set, but cultural fit, incredibly important part of maybe there are 10 people that have been working together for years. You're going to put someone new into the mix. It's the same sort of environment of a storming, forming, norming, performing cycle at any board, even if it's a nonprofit. But I find sometimes not as much attention is paid to cultural fit. It might be that they have the right backgrounds or connections, so we're bringing them on. And I imagine that could lead to some of the issues you're talking about just now.
Well, yes, but I'll say that sometimes, and I think I've seen this on at least one or two occasions, either myself or somebody else, but with myself, I've been asked to be on a board to perhaps change the culture a little bit or shake it up a little bit. I tend to be someone who again, with the law background, having taken a lot of depositions, I like to ask questions and get to the point. And there are some cultures, as you know, especially in nonprofits, where things are a lot more I'm trying to think of the right word, but
more talk shop.
Getting directly to the point with a direct question can sometimes be considered rude.
Right.
So you have to be careful, and I would never encourage rudeness, but sometimes you are being asked to be on a board, I've found, because the culture needs more of what you have culturally. You just have to be very, very careful that you're not upsetting things too much. But if you can intuit that you're being asked to come in to affect the culture a little bit, then so be it. It might shake things up a little bit, but ultimately kindness and patience play a big role in all of that. But I wouldn't be too hesitant to play your part in affecting and being affecting the culture.
I think that's great guidance because it ties back to what you said earlier about knowing exactly why you're being brought in, and sometimes it might be to affect change.
Yes.
My sister reminds me, change can be your friend, right? So when we think about observing and understanding and knowing your place on a board and human interactions, in your role, I would love to hear some of your experiences where sometimes you're reporting to board. You might just be in the room as a counsel, listening to a board and how they're going about it. What have you intuited from those sorts of experience that allow you to become a better board member on the groups that you're working with?
There are a number of boards that I report to. So having been on many boards, one of the things that has really helped my career is that I do a lot of work with endowments. I manage investment endowments, relatively small ones for, small colleges and seminaries, things like that. And so I'm reporting to boards quite often. And one of the differentiators I have is that a lot of these boards aren't particularly functional, especially with some of their committee work. And some of them have committees that just don't meet, or they don't have the right expertise, or they're not fulfilling their fiduciary role very well. And so oftentimes I've found myself coming into these settings and advising them, hey, you need to create an investment committee. It needs to meet at least this many times. They should be asking me these questions. This is what they should be looking at.
Sounds like you're giving them the idiot's guide for how to run it.
Well, and again, it's these nonprofits have different cycles. Sometimes they have great boards, and then board members go off, and the boards aren't so great. And sometimes they'll go through these cycles where things have gotten neglected. I found a lot of this after the Great Recession because these institutions were doing everything they could to survive. So a lot of these other functions got put on the shelf for a while. So I show up in 2009 or 10 or 11 or 12 or whenever it is I get hired, and these things have been neglected, and so I'm helping to rebuild it. So my board experience has really helped to be able to assist these organizations in getting their act back together.
And I said that with a smile on my face. I'm going to actually call it best practices, right? Because for some organizations, especially some of the nonprofits, that's what they aspire to, but have never had the counsel like you'll be able to give them before, haven't had the time or the expertise to get there. And it can be a tough slog to help an organization get there. But as a board member, or perhaps just as an advisor in your situation, it feels great to get an organization functioning at the level they should be at.
Right. Especially if you walk in and they're open-minded, they realize where they are, and they're willing to accept your help. There are others where you have to be a little more politic in pointing things out, but even there, it can be very rewarding because even if at the end of the day they didn't realize it was your advice that got them there, it still got them there, and so that has been a very rewarding part of kind of my day-to-day work.
And we've talked a bit about this thus far, Doug, but we've had several different types of experience we've described in terms of board roles. And we've seen it from the individual perspective and the organizational perspective. So I'm curious how you would answer this. What do you think the biggest boardroom challenges are today?
The biggest boardroom challenges, wow. I think as I reflect on the boards I've been on, they're always cycling people in and out. So that, of course, is a challenge to keep things going. I think one of the biggest challenges would be caring for the head, the president, the headmaster, the executive director, whatever their role is, because a lot of these institutions. And again, I'm working in the nonprofit world mostly with this stuff. These institutions have people that struggle with having the resources to have enough staff, and financially they may or may not be a financial person. So there are a lot of pieces to the leadership of the organization that the board really is filling. I may walk in there with a financial skill that does not exist in the organization. Or someone may walk in with knowledge about HR that no one at the organization has knowledge of. So to be able to fill in all those gaps and to be able to help the head of the organization and to really have an ear for how that leader is doing. Some leaders are very, very good at communicating. Some not so much, but in any event, a lot of them are struggling, and it's not enough to just say, yeah, the finances look good, or to ask the really hard questions on the finances and say, come back to us with better, a better budget. It's not enough to give them the hard questions and make sure they're doing their job. I think a lot of times it's, what do you need? A lot of times the boards aren't doing enough of that and saying, okay, as a board, maybe we need 2 or 3 other people on the board because we don't have these areas of expertise, or maybe we need to figure out a way for and give the hard advice to the president that they really need to downsize or they need to do this. So a lot of times it really is just a matter of supporting, helping, sometimes with tough love, but helping the head of the organization and taking that role very, very seriously.
And I absolutely agree with you. And so one of our previous episodes, Steve Bartlett, and I'll link to this in the show notes, was talking about from the public company perspective, but it fits just like you're talking about from nonprofit perspective, the organization's leader, whether that's the executive director or the CEO. He was saying that your number one job as a board member, clearly you're thinking about shareholders, stakeholders, but the main person you're really thinking about is the health of the leader. Because if that person fails in whatever version that means for you, the organization is going to go through a dramatic problem. And I think that fits exactly with what you're saying now.
Yeah, and as a board member, you play a big role. You can be way too harsh on the president. And bottom line is, you are there to essentially, in one way or shape or form, hold them accountable, or to at least they report to you. And there's no question about that. But it's also your role for the health of the organization to make sure this person succeeds. Right. Obviously, there are some times when it's the job of the board to move that person out. But as long as they're there, you're there to help them succeed. And you sometimes need to be very proactive in figuring out what the best way to do that is. And that's why you should always have executive session. A lot of boards forget to do that every time. And make sure that they're giving feedback. I was involved with one organization where the leader of the institution was begging for feedback. He hadn't had a review by the board in several years when I arrived.
Wow.
And so just giving him a review once a year, so he at least knew where he stood and how he was doing, was huge. He was begging for that. So the boards fail to do that quite often in many different ways.
Well, Doug, I feel like we've covered so much ground today, both from an individual's perspective, the organization perspective, being an advisor on the side, reporting into boards. I wonder if as we sort of get ready to wrap up, whether you have any parting advice for new or aspiring board members.
Well, the biggest advice, and I've already said it, involves the mission. Always respect the mission, always respect the staff, always respect the leader. And realize that you have a limited role, a very important one, but don't overstep it, because those other individuals are in it every day. They're there representing the mission every day, and you're playing a limited role. And make sure that it's a mission that you can get behind before you even get there. That makes the work so much easier, because these boards take a lot of time. And the worst thing you can do is agree to a 2-year or 3-year term and quit early because it's more than you thought it would be, or it's different than you thought it would be. You really want to know. And if the mission is something that you're really passionate about, then you'll stick it out and you'll do a good job.
Well, Doug, I think that was my favorite nugget for today. Of many people think about a board role as a way to network, and we're very clear, yes, that's true. But if you come from an abundance perspective of the first board you get asked will not be the last board you get asked on, finding the right board where you're right fit, and you can do that stuff as well. I think that's fantastic advice. And Doug, thank you so much for being a part of the Boardroom Bound podcast today. What would be the best way for our audience to follow up with you?
Well, I work at an organization called Compass Ion Advisors. It's a very simple website, IONADV as in Victor. .com, and my email is dmacgray@ionadv.com, and happy to answer any questions or follow up on anything from this or any other reason people would want to reach out to me.
Oh, great. Well, I will make sure we put both of those in the show notes, and we were delighted to have you on the Boardroom Bound podcast. Thank you so much, Doug, for sharing your insights and helping all of our audience.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you, Alexander.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Doug MacGray. I loved his philosophy that find boards that you're passionate about, not only because you want to do well for the board, but that's when you're going to be at your best. So if you're thinking you're going to a board to network, and frankly, that's why a lot of people go into the board stuff, work with fascinating people to network, you will be at your best self if it's an organization that aligns with your interests and your skill set. Can't agree with that more. I also love his nugget that sometimes your job is to shake things up on a board. You might not be there for status quo. That involves knowing why you're coming onto the board, knowing the people, knowing the structure and the situation. So we got some good stories from Doug about that. Remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu, where you can get links to all the resources we talked about today. And if you enjoyed this episode, please take 30 seconds to leave us a review on iTunes. Reviews on iTunes are one of the best ways to get out word about this podcast. So thanks for joining me on the show today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.